I'm pretty curious about what it is that makes great leaders stand out and what it is that sets them apart from the ordinary. And in fact, what it would take for each of us to be seen as a great leader. So I'd like to share with you some of my experiences, and in particular, some of my leadership failings, and in fact, what I've learned. In 1989, I deployed to the Islamic Republic of Iran as a United Nations military observer. And I was in the second of two contingents of Kiwi peacekeepers that went over there. And the war between Iran and Iraq had been finished for around a year. And it was still a lot happening, but it was our job to go there and get into it. I was 24 years old and a captain in the infantry. And I was confident, assertive, and I had a reasonable degree of leadership experience. Other people would probably say that I was a bit too full of my own importance, and I think it's fair to say in retrospect that I probably thought I was better than I really was, but I was 24, and who doesn't at 24? It was pretty cool being a UN military observer at 24, and one of the really neat things was that we worked in these small multinational teams, so that made it really diverse and really exciting. Our role in Iran was to patrol the ceasefire line between Iran and Iraq and to check on the conditions of the ceasefire agreement. So we were looking for violations to that agreement. And violations could be firing of weapons or new weapons being brought there or new trenches or taking of prisoners. So it was a pretty engaging, active thing to be involved with. And I spent 14 months in Iran. And the early part of my experiences were in the Iranian Kurdistan province. And this is a really desolate, mountainous, sparsely populated area, and it's the home of the famous Silk Route. And in the photos shown, hard to pick out and discern, but in the middle of that photo is a small Kurdish village. But just gives you an idea of how barren the landscape is. We tended to work in teams of 2 UN observers, and we'd be accompanied by an Iranian liaison officer. And shown here is Mohammed Samimi, an absolutely outstanding individual and a guy I'd love to go back and see. Officially, his job was to be our guide and translator. But unofficially, of course, he was our minder. And he was there to stop us perhaps poking our noses into the things that the Iranian authorities didn't want us to see. That's his job. So we'd set out on patrol each day and we'd visit a number of positions. And on arrival, after negotiating some pretty hair-raising driving, we'd be met by the local Iranian commander. And invariably, there'd be an offer of chai. So an expectation we'd share glasses of black tea, tons of sugar, which Nigel later would love, and just talk, and just engage in small talk. And I struggle with this. I wasn't there to make friends. My job, as I saw it, was to get out there and find the violations. And so I guess I humoured this time to talk, but I was impatient to get to work. And so we'd go around, we'd find things to talk about and argue about. And we'd come back to the vehicles, and I was in a real hurry to get on to the next position or back to the team site. And so I'd tend to ignore the other offer of chai at the end of it. After a few weeks, maybe a month, I started to feel that actually things weren't working too well. Because when I would revisit a position for the second or third or fourth time, there was a degree of hostility that hadn't been there earlier. I mean, where there'd been smiles, there was now really just surliness. And I didn't really actually feel that safe, and I didn't expect to feel that way or quite know what was going on. So I well remember driving back to the team site one afternoon, mulling over what had changed, and I came to the very uncomfortable conclusion that actually the problem was me. I'd been rude and insensitive, and I guess tolerance for my behaviour had pretty much run out. So I think the problem was that I was in an Eastern culture, but behaving in a very stereotypical Western way. I was there to get a job done, but I'd completely forgotten that people were involved. I thought leadership was about doing something, but I didn't recognise that people are part of the process and that I've got to build a relationship. That wasn't obvious to me at the time, but it certainly is now. when we arrived, the offer of chai was a ritual. It was an opportunity to connect. It was a chance to I guess, put aside our political, ideological, and cultural differences and just find what the similarities were. It was a ritual of connection. It was a ritual of building relationships. Because when we'd go out and check the position and look for violations, you can guarantee there's going to be tension. I'm going to find something. It's my job. And so there's going to be disagreements, but we can now approach it in a degree of relative safety. We can depersonalise the problem from the person. In a similar way, the offer of chai at the end of the visit signified a chance to park the business and reconnect, so that when we go on our way, we do so with a sense of perspective. And I guess what I learned to understand was that how could the Iranians trust me to fairly and honestly report against the terms of the ceasefire if they had no sense of me as a person? Why would they trust me? So I learned in Iran that I needed to flick a mental switch, and I need to understand that leadership, it's about getting the job done, but fundamentally at its heart, it's about building relationships. That is the essence of how the work gets done. Because things only happen when you have the willing and cooperative efforts of other people. You can't do it without it. Now, I think we start our careers as doctors or lawyers or plumbers or graphic designers or whatever, and we're subject matter experts. And then often we find ourselves moving into leadership roles. And suddenly there's all these new things we have to learn. Whether it's budgeting, planning, coordinating, delegating. And yet, just as I did in Iran, perhaps too often we forget about the people. And we may neglect to build our understanding of what it is that makes human interaction successful. We don't necessarily connect the emotions with the outcomes. And so maybe we just don't get the human dimension. It's not something we're taught to do. Life in the military is often centred around action and travel, and you certainly learn to embrace the uncertainty that comes with that. And I thrived on that sense of adventure. The problem is that in the old days, our training would be all about making us be action-oriented, and to look for opportunities where we could personally influence mission success. That means it was all about us. We weren't thinking that action occurs through other people as well. In 1998, I got to go to Bougainville as part of a New Zealand-led truce monitoring group. And the 8-year war of succession between Papua New Guinea and Bougainville was in a state of uneasy truce. I was one of 4 team leaders, and we were each responsible for around 1/4 of the island. I was now a lieutenant colonel, but I actually had quite a bit to learn about leadership still. I was responsible for leading a team of around 30, and the team was drawn from Vanuatu, Fiji, New Zealand, and Australia. And I worked through 3 subordinate patrol leaders, and these captains in turn led small teams. And their job was to travel widely throughout the area of operations. Their job was to take the messages of the peace process and try to build the trust towards the reconciliation that needed to follow. My job now was quite different. I was pretty much stuck in an office, planning, coordinating, and thinking about the actions of the patrols. And so, it wasn't difficult, and in fact it was quite frustrating, because from my perspective, the teams were the ones having all the fun. And so it wasn't hard for me to be tempted to go out with those patrols. And I'm ashamed to say I did that too many times. Wasn't always fun, though. It was probably my fault, this one. But the problem is that I wasn't leading. I certainly wasn't leading in what I had to do. My job was to keep the global perspective across what was happening across all those patrols, and to make sure I could see the patterns emerging and know where we needed to put our energies. But I was also failing because I was stepping on the toes of my captains. My thirst for action meant that I was, stepping on their toes quite literally. And what would happen is that I'd tend to, quite inadvertently, take over because I couldn't help myself. And so I completely missed the point of what I was there to do. And I wasn't even coaching them. I'd just be there impinging on their decision-making ability and their autonomy. And it wasn't helping their confidence. In fact, they were quite pissed off with me. So it took quite a tragic incident to bring this lesson home to me. And at 4 a.m. one morning, and it was a morning where the boss of a truce monitoring group, my boss, was due to fly over and visit me and get a regular update on what was happening, a group of men robbed a store. And in making their getaway, they fired their weapons. And this was a store in a village of the opposing side, so you can imagine the tension. Some of their bullets passed through the wall of the house, and one of them hit and killed a 4-year-old girl. This is a tragedy for the family and the village, but from our perspective, this just could be the incident that reignited very real simmering tensions. And so it was patently clear to us we had to act very quickly to get the key local leaders together so that we could negotiate how we deal with this and restore a sense of calm. Now, I got lost in the action, and it was only the sound of the approaching helicopter that reminded me that my boss was about to arrive. And so I walked over, briefed him, here's what's happened, here's what we're doing. And as quick as my brief was, his response was quicker. He simply said, "Rob, do you need any help? Because if you don't, I'll leave you to it." And that's what he did. So he taught me a lesson that, he trusted me, he trusted my team, and he recognised that he didn't need to be there. And because he didn't need to be there, it was his job not to be there. So he showed that he understood how I was thinking. He showed the impact of his behaviour on me because he thought about what I was going through. So my boss that day was a New Zealand Army colonel by the name of Jerry Mataparai. And I had great delight last night meeting Jerry again and having a chat to him about it and reminding him. But he taught me a lot, and I'm grateful to him for that lesson on leadership, about understanding to base your behaviour on what people were thinking and feeling, because that builds a relationship, and that's where trust comes from. He taught me that emotional intelligence is just as important as technical intelligence, if not more so. Well, as I look out at the world, I can't help but wonder whether enough leaders think like Sir Jerry. And I am worried that people in leadership roles may not fully understand that enough. Deloitte's believe differently, and Deloitte's most global research, they indicate that 80% of senior leaders do believe that engagement is both important and necessary. But I'm sceptical, because believing one thing and doing something are two different things. So I'm not sure. But I think the military have something we can learn from, and it should make us think. In the military, there's the mantra that combat power is the outcome of firepower, manoeuvre, and morale. So what the military say is that fully 1/3 of effectiveness comes just from the way that people are feeling. But you didn't expect that. I want to introduce you to a hero of mine. And this is a leader who does get that. And not only that, his organisation allows him to act that way. So the hero of this story is Warrant Officer Danny Broughton. And Danny holds the position of Warrant Officer of the Defence Force. He's the third person to hold it, and this is a role that Sir Jerry introduced. And he follows in the footsteps of two other great New Zealand leaders. Danny's role was pure leadership. He's got no budget to manage or KPIs to report against. His job is to network, and his currency is morale. And you'll most often find Danny with people who are closest to the front line. And he spends most of his time just listening. His job is to keep the Chief of the Defence Force attuned to the pulse of the military. And so he gives Lieutenant General Tim Keating the unvarnished truth of what servicemen and women are thinking and feeling, with no interference between. He's there to tell it as it is. So why would you need someone like Danny, or a role like Danny's, at an organisation that arguably does have a very well-defined leadership hierarchy and does have leaders who should understand this. Well, perhaps in its wisdom, the Defence Force realises that leaders are drawn in so many directions, and that despite their best efforts, their focus is often taken away from their people. Well, Danny's support is wide. In February this year, he supported Overwatch, which is a Defence Force organisation that supports gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender and intersex community within Defence. He cared enough to be there. He knew that his support was necessary. More recently, in September, he travelled to the UK for the Invictus Games, which is like a mini Olympics for wounded, injured, sick servicemen and women. So he's on the periphery, showing that he gets it. He gets that feelings matter. Now, I can't help but wonder whether, there isn't a need for more people like Danny round. And I guess I look at Fonterra and Air New Zealand and Christchurch City Council, and I wonder, why don't we have positions like Danny's, who just think about morale? And they report it up, free of political or interference or bias. What would it take for that to be the case? And what do you think the outcome might be? So I think that great leaders understand that relationships are the key to getting the job done, and they understand that relationships are founded on being attuned to how people think and feel. And if you can do that, it means you can choose behaviours that allow people to be at their best. And that means that you understand that leadership is not about you, it's about everybody else. So I think my apprenticeship on leadership has really only just begun. And as Sir Jerry reminded me, it's probably the truth. But I'm going to keep on being curious about what it is that makes great leaders great. And I hope that you will too, because I think, beneath everything else, we are in this together. Thank you.